Great. So week 68 of our weekly discussions. And I'm surprised we haven't explicitly talked about this one yet, because this is a big one, the passage of the Alabaster Jars. And I want to look at that with regards to effective altruism. I also want to think of it as a kind of effective altruism of a certain symbolic type. So that's something we can discuss here. But this is EA for Christians. We're part of the EA community, which is a community focused on using evidence and careful reasoning to find the very best ways to improve the world and then to act on that basis. So we want to take the insights from EA and apply it so that we can better serve others as Christ calls us to. So I want to start out with a question. I've asked this question before, if you've been here, and I think all of you have been here many times. But maybe just think for a second about the best gift you ever remember receiving. Maybe it was Christmas time, maybe it was a birthday, maybe it was your father or a friend who just put together an extremely thoughtful gift. What was that? How did that make you feel? And I want to think now of a time that Jesus was given an extremely thoughtful gift. And it was a jar, an alabaster jar. And I think we all know this story, but why don't we read the passage again? There are actually 4 accounts of this story. I'm going to read the Matthew account for brevity. And it goes like this. Jesus was in Bethany in the home of Simon the leper. A woman came to him with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume, which she poured on his head, and he was reclining at the table. When the disciples saw this, they were indignant. Why this waste? They asked. This perfume could have been sold at a high price and the money given to the poor. Aware of this, Jesus said to them, why are you bothering this woman? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, but you will not always have me. And when she poured this perfume on my body, she did it to prepare me for burial. Truly, I tell you, wherever this gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of me, or memory of her. There are a couple of difficulties with this passage. The first, I just want to briefly mention, there is a variation of this passage. So there's an account in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and each is slightly different. Each expresses a different aspect of the theological narrative message that the gospel authors are trying to portray. And but for the synoptic gospels, the message is very much the same, and many of these key lines are found, including the poor will always be with you, which is a recount of Deuteronomy 15. Another difficulty from this passage is that the disciples sound quite like a stereotypical effective altruist, at least in scare quotes. So a couple of things here. So when the disciples saw this, they were indignant. Why this waste, they asked. This perfume could have been sold at a high price and the money been given to the poor. There are a couple of stereotypical, again, in scare quotes, aspects of this that I want to point out. First is this critical mindset of bad charity. So I remember some of my first encounters with EA. We talked about things like the water pump that took the form of a merry-go-round. What was that called again? The play pump, which was this seemingly great way to do good, but it was actually a massive waste, and that was uncovered quite lately. And sometimes when EA's talked about, maybe there's just like a slight criticalness about bad charity. But I don't mean to get too much into that. I mean to just say the disciples are very critical. They're not just critical, they're indignant, even stronger. And they view donations as a primary way to do good. This money could have been given to the poor. But of course, that's not all that they viewed about doing good. They did much good in the New Testament without donations, but donations is put as this one way that we could do tremendous good. There's this idea that maybe welfare and again, this isn't explicitly in the text here, but maybe there's an idea here that welfare is preferred over other forms of value, like beauty and devotion. And the disciples are thinking here, or at least many EAs might even think here that, oh, what's most important is welfare. Maybe that does include components of beauty and devotion, but at the end of the day, the welfare of the many and the mass is going to outweigh that of the few, or just Jesus. We see that the woman's alabaster jar was very expensive. I mean, this was worth something like a year's wages. And whatever good this did Jesus, perhaps it could have done even more good, the disciples thought, if it was just sold and the money given to many, many poor people. So there is some prima facie sense in which the disciples sound like a quote unquote stereotypical effective altruist, critically seen. And then Jesus's words seem to affirm the woman's deed. He says to the disciples, why are you bothering this woman? She's done a beautiful thing to me. Truly, I tell you, wherever this gospel is preached throughout the world, what she's done will also be told in memory of her. So there's a couple reasons why we would want to praise the woman's deed. And the first is that it was just stunningly beautiful, right? It required tremendous personal sacrifice. It was a gift in hard times. It was immensely personal, and there were also probably some unknown meanings here. So we know from commentators that this jar is probably worth something like a year's wages, and a year's wages when you're when you live in a country with a social safety net is still quite a lot of money. Like I'm thinking a year's wages, like that's a lot of money for me, right? And just thinking in her time and in her context, to dedicate a year's wages to this person who may or may not ever pay her back. I mean, that's a tremendous personal sacrifice in a very difficult time. It was also a gift in a hard time. So in Matthew's gospel, this deed was given to Jesus or done to Jesus just before the cross, really not too long before. And gifts during hard times are sometimes the most meaningful gifts we receive. It's in those difficult places when we're most receptive to other people's compassion. And it was also immensely personal. She wiped Jesus with her hair and tears. Different accounts have different details here, but she really put her full self into her service. And maybe there was some other unknown meaning. You know, I've been watching The Chosen lately, and you see in The Chosen this aspect, the TV series, this aspect where every character, as in real life, has this backstory, and every act of love and of kindness has this backstory that we might not even see or know. And when I read the passage here, I think, wow, maybe, who knows, if this was Mary Magdalene, maybe she had some kind of past with prostitution, and the perfume had some kind of connection with her former sinful life, and her sacrificing this had some incredible personal meaning unique to her. So it was a stunningly beautiful act, but it also left an enduring legacy. Jesus said that wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what this woman has done will also be told in memory of her. And as an EA, I think of long-termism. I think of how so much of the value, the moral value in this world lies ahead of us, lies in God's future. And here we have Christ talking about how what this woman did will be told presumably for generations, right? And that's of incredible value, even from a more EA long-termist perspective, or maybe precisely from an EA long-termist perspective. You might look at a deed like this and say, this isn't anti-effective altruist. This is like one of the most effective altruistic acts that you can do. And one of the main reasons why, or perhaps the main reason why this would be, especially from a Christian perspective, is that showing devotion to Christ, as Alex Ratty put it, is arguably the most valuable thing that you can do. And perhaps the moral value of devotion to Christ outweighed the moral value that could be achieved by donating that money to the poor. Christ, the poor we always have with us. Christ we do not always have with us. This woman had Christ with her. She had an opportunity to serve God, like directly in the most full sense. And that makes her deed arguably very praiseworthy. And then there's some other components to that, right? Like Mike has this good article where he talks about how Jesus's response proves that, that the exception proves the rule, right? The disciples' response is like a natural human response, and also for the effective altruist, it's like the right response. Generally, we should try to help more people if we can. We should use our resources wisely. We should serve the poor. And the very fact that Jesus responded the way he did was to highlight an exception, but not to undermine the rule, but to prove the rule that we should care about the many and we should be serving the poor. So here are some discussion questions. Since we're a smaller group today, we can stay all together, but some questions we can talk about are like, what are some big takeaways for you from this passage? No need to be too grandiose here, but like what specifically sticks out to you, and what has powerful personal presence for you from this text? Also, Jesus isn't here with us in person, so at least not bodily, right? So how could we best imitate the woman's example of devotion? What does an act of devotion to God look like when God isn't sitting down with us the way that Jesus sat at a table with her? Alex talked about Matthew 25, which is a passage where Jesus identifies with the poor. This is known as like the preferential option for the poor. And Jesus says, whatever you do unto the least of these, you do unto me. And do you think that showing devotion to the poor is the same as showing devotion unto Christ? That's one interpretation that people have. Also, there is some commentary about whether charity can become a form of idolatry if it's motivated outside of devotion to Jesus. Is that true? Does our motivations for our charity have to come in response to Christ's love? Do we do it because it's the right thing? How do you think about this in your own framework? These are a lot of questions, so we can just talk about whatever's most interesting. But finally, there's a lot of extravagant acts of devotion nowadays. And are there any that you think in today's context, putting aside the passage we read today in their context, are there any acts of devotion in today's context that you believe would be highly effective, that might that might draw some second looks from someone of a more calculating, optimizing mindset? I.e., are there any alabaster jar opportunities nowadays?